All right.
So, what do you remember about America in the 1990s?
America in the 1990s. The one thing I remember is that I really started to pay attention to politics in the 1990s. And I remember when Bill Clinton was elected, it was a pretty big deal because he was a fairly young president. And so I remember feeling very hopeful in the 1990s. And I remember that I became a political, not a junkie, but somebody who I really started to pay attention to politics, and as I mentioned already once before. But what I liked most about politics, I really liked Bill Clinton until he continued to disappoint me.
Okay.
I feel like I could do better there, but
it's okay.
All right. Are people gonna see this?
Yeah.
Oh God.
Just 6th period.
Okay.
Okay. What were you up to during the 1990s? Like, what were you doing?
The 1990s was a big decade. I transitioned from really liking rap music to liking rock and roll. I graduated from high school. I decided that I was going to go to college. I decided that I was going to be a teacher, and I graduated from college. So it was a very busy educational and learning experience type of a decade for me.
When did you graduate? Was that
1999.
1999?
Yeah.
Okay. Right at the end of the 90s.
Yeah.
So then you went to high school during...
I graduated in 1993, and then I took 2 years off of school, and then I went to Central Washington University in 1995.
Do you remember, like, what technology was coming out just around that time, or any inventions that kind of like changed your life?
Well, it was interesting because that's when computers started to get... I remember when I got my very first email address in 1996. I got a Hotmail account, and I struggled with technology. I mean, there was a computer lab at Central, and I remember just thinking how weird that was, because I'd never really, I'd always handwritten papers, and I'd always, I just had never needed to learn how to really type, and I found that, God, the internet thing was pretty cool. I didn't have a whole lot of experience with it because it didn't quite catch on, but by the end of 1999, and I started teaching, using the internet, email, all that stuff was pretty revolutionary for me during that decade. But in terms of anything other than that, grunge music was pretty revolutionary, but that's not really technology, so.
Yeah. Do you remember some of your favorite sport moments?
Excuse me. The sport moment that I remember most was 1995 when the Mariners made the playoffs for the very first time, and I was a huge baseball fan growing up, and so 1995 was really, really special for me personally. I'll never forget where I was. I tried to buy tickets to the one-game playoff against the Angels, and it was Randy Johnson against Mark Langston, and I didn't get tickets, and so I had to watch it on TV. And I remember I skipped school that day to watch it, because I skipped a class, I should say. I didn't skip school, but I skipped a class that day to watch that, so I could sit on my couch at my parents' house and watch that entire game with my girlfriend, who could have cared less about baseball. But I'll never forget that. I also remember when the Seahawks, because I really enjoy football as well, and the Seahawks hired Mike Holmgren, I believe it was in 1999, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven when that happened as well. So those are the biggies for me.
So then it sounds like you lived in around the Seattle area most of your life.
Yeah, the only time I haven't lived in Snohomish or King County was when I went to Central Washington University for 4.5, 5 years. So.
What were some major political developments occurring in the 90s, and then how did they affect you personally?
Well, what was cool about the 1990s is 1989, I know I'm not supposed to talk about the 80s, but when we talk about 1989, we talk about between 1989 and 1991 is when the Cold War ended. And so all of those, the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc countries began to get their freedom from the Soviet Union. That was really something interesting to pay attention to. It was one of the things that really got me interested in history in the first place, was to watch that history happen. Because when I grew up, you know, the Soviets were considered the enemy, the communists, and when I was a little kid, I believed in it because of the movies I watched, the comics that I read, TV shows that were on. I mean, the communists were the enemies, and so we were supposed to believe that the communists were the enemies, and the communism fell, and the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and next thing you know, all these countries became free. And it was really, really interesting. And then, you know, the United States also invaded Kuwait in 1991. I remember for the very first time, you know, in my life, the Vietnam War was ending when I was born, and I hadn't really got to watch a war on TV before. And you remember, you probably don't remember this, but CNN carried the whole entire thing live. You got to literally watch the troops shoot their big old missiles and cannons into Kuwait to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And it was an interesting thing to watch. In terms of the rest of the 1990s, there was, I remember, the Bosnian conflict and the Serbian conflict that led to some genocide in the former Yugoslavia. I remember that being kind of a wake-up call. Lots of different civil war that occurred in a bunch of different African nations as well. And I kind of started to pay attention to that stuff a little bit more than I had, you know, maybe when I was in middle school or junior high school. So that's really some of the things that I remember.
You've already covered some of this, but
no, sorry,
that's
dude.
not a problem. You remember any like national, state, local tragedy crises?
You know, when I was talking to Mrs. Gilday, a big thing that happened in the 1990s was grunge music. That was huge for somebody like me who liked music. And I remember being more of a Pearl Jam fan than a Nirvana fan. And when Kurt Cobain died, it was kind of strange. Mainly because he was this guy who brought so much attention to the area that I lived in. And it was strange because you'd read magazines that talked about how if you wanted to be grunge, how you should dress. And it was kind of strange, and this was all from because of Kurt Cobain and the music that he created, you know, starting in the late 80s. But he got real popular, and it was interesting. I got to go see all those bands that were growing up that the national news thought were so cool and so strange and so different. And so it was cool because I really dug music, and it was a big deal to have all that attention come to the Seattle area. You know, bands like Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, all these bands that are no longer, or actually now are back together again after all those years. It was an interesting time to live in the area.
And then last question.
Yeah.
During this decade, what were the major like wars and military involvements of the U.S., and then did they impact you?
I talked about that a little bit. In terms of what impacted the United States, the 1990s was kind of a time where we didn't necessarily get involved in too many conflicts other than Desert Storm. We were more of the type of country that wanted to throw money at problems. We threw money at the problems in Afghanistan. We threw money at the problems in the Middle East. We were a huge supporter of Israel during the time period financially. We were a huge supporter of you know, sending peacekeepers and having the United Nations kind of deal with some of these world problems where we kind of sat back and didn't do a ton. So in terms of what I remember during that time period, I mean, Desert Storm was big. We did not like Saddam Hussein, and so we continued to learn about how he was an enemy of our country. And we kind of watched countries that maybe were democratic at a time maybe become less democratic. And you know, in terms of our involvement, it was mostly covert operations and things that, off the top of my head, at this late in the school year, I kind of embarrassingly maybe have forgotten about. So.